When a wealthy businessman dismissed his maid after she revealed she was pregnant, he thought he had closed that chapter of his life for good. However, 15 years later, a shocking encounter brought him face to face with the son he never knew. What happens next will leave you stunned. If you haven't subscribed yet, do so now. You won't want to miss how this incredible story unfolds. It was another opulent morning in the grand mansion of Maxwell Dalton, the man whose name alone sent ripples through the business world. At 45, Maxwell was at the peak of his career, CEO of Dalton Enterprises, a company known for its dominance in the construction and real estate sectors. He sat at the head of the breakfast table, wearing a crisp, tailored suit. Everything about him screamed success, from the gold watch on his wrist to the leather shoes that barely touched the marbled floors. Across the table sat Victoria, his wife of 20 years. Her face was caked with makeup, her jewelry flashy, her phone glued to her manicured hand as she scrolled through her messages. The atmosphere between them was tense, as usual. "Max, you need to fire that girl," Victoria said, without even looking up. Maxwell sighed. "What girl?" "That maid, Clara. I don't trust her. I've seen the way she looks at you." Maxwell smirked, sipping his coffee. "Don't be ridiculous. She's just a maid." Victoria shot him a sharp glare. "Fire her. I don't care how competent she is. I don't want her in this house." Maxwell shrugged it off. Victoria's paranoia had become part of their daily routine. But in truth, Clara was hard to ignore. She was in her mid-20s, with large, kind eyes, and a demeanor that exuded quiet strength. Clara worked tirelessly, never complaining, always polite, her small frame flitting around the massive house like a shadow. She was different, and Maxwell noticed it. The encounter that changed everything happened on a rainy evening. Clara had been cleaning Maxwell's study, dusting the vast bookshelves lined with old leather-bound volumes. Maxwell entered without warning, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He had been drinking more than usual lately, burdened by the pressures of running a multi-million-dollar company and his unraveling marriage. "Mr. Dalton," Clara said, startled. She clutched the dusting cloth, her hands trembling slightly. Maxwell stared at her for a moment, his gaze lingering. She wore a simple dress, modest and neat, her dark hair tied back. Something about the way she looked, so unassuming, so pure, struck him. "You work too hard, Clara," he said, his voice soft but slurred. Clara blinked. "I'm just doing my job, sir." "Sit down," he said suddenly, gesturing to the armchair in front of his desk. "Sir?" "Sit," he insisted, and she obeyed reluctantly. Maxwell poured another drink and sat across from her. "How long have you been working here?" he asked. "Almost a year, sir." "And yet I hardly know you," he murmured, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "You're different, Clara, not like the others." Clara fidgeted, uneasy under his gaze. "I don't understand, sir." Maxwell leaned closer. "You're too beautiful to be scrubbing floors." Clara's face flushed red. "Mr. Dalton, He reached out and touched her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Relax, Clara. I'm just saying what's true." Clara stood abruptly, pulling her hand back. "I should go. I still have work to do." Maxwell watched her leave, a sly smile on his lips. That was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, Maxwell found ways to be near Clara. He complimented her often, slipping money into her hand for extra work. He would linger in the kitchen when she was cooking or find reasons to call her to his office. At first, Clara resisted, feeling the weight of impropriety, but Maxwell's charm was relentless. He made her feel seen, special, things no one had ever made her feel before. One evening, Maxwell invited Clara to his private quarters under the pretense of discussing household duties. "I trust you, Clara. You're not like the others," he said softly, stepping closer. Before she could respond, he kissed her. Clara froze, her heart racing, her mind a blur of confusion. It was a kiss that led to a mistake that would change both their lives forever. A month later, Clara began to feel ill. She would wake up nauseated, her body weak. At first, she dismissed it as exhaustion from overwork, but as the days passed, the truth became undeniable. One afternoon, she sat on the edge of her tiny bed in the maid's quarters, staring at the pregnancy test in her trembling hands. It was positive. "No," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "This can't be happening." Panic overwhelmed her. She thought of Maxwell, of Victoria, of the scandal it would cause. She thought of her parents back in her village, who had sent her to the city to earn a living. How could she face them? Shame burned through her. Clara's first instinct was to get rid of the baby. She found a clinic and made an appointment. But as she sat in the waiting room, surrounded by sterile white walls and the faint hum of fluorescent lights, doubt gnawed at her. This is a life. Your life. The nurse called her name, but Clara stood up and left the clinic without looking back. A few days later, Maxwell confronted her. "You've been acting strange, Clara," he said. "What's going on?" Clara hesitated but decided to tell him. "I'm pregnant, sir." Maxwell froze, his expression unreadable. Then his face hardened. "Are you serious?" Clara nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "You need to leave," he said coldly. "But, Mr. Dalton, I'll give you some money, enough to keep quiet. But you can't stay here." Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her. "You're firing me?" "It's for the best," he said curtly. "Take the money and go." Clara's voice cracked. "You can't just throw me away like this." "I said leave!" Maxwell roared, slamming his fist on the table. Clara flinched, her tears spilling freely now. She packed her belongings in silence and walked out of the mansion that night, clutching an envelope of cash and her shattered dignity. As she stepped into the rain, she whispered to herself, "I'll survive. For my child, I'll survive." The mansion lights faded behind her, but her resolve burned brighter than ever. The rain poured relentlessly as Clara trudged down the dark streets, her meager belongings in hand. The world felt cold and unwelcoming, but the small flutter of life inside her gave her purpose. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, but Clara was determined to survive. She spent the night at a shelter for women, sharing a cramped space with strangers whose stories mirrored her own struggles. The next morning, Clara sat on a rickety cot, clutching her abdomen. "I'll give you everything I have," she whispered. "You'll never feel unloved." Life outside the Dalton mansion was harsh. Clara found a small, cheap room to rent in the slums of the city. The walls were damp, the ceiling leaked, and the air reeked of mildew. But it was hers. It was a place where she could start fresh. She quickly realized that the money Maxwell had given her wouldn't last long. Her small savings would barely cover rent and food for a month, let alone prenatal care. Clara needed a job, and she needed it fast. With her pregnancy just beginning to show, finding work was nearly impossible. She went from door to door asking for cleaning or cooking jobs. Most people turned her away the moment they noticed her condition. Others offered meager pay that wouldn't even buy a loaf of bread. After weeks of rejection, Clara found herself standing in front of a tiny diner on the outskirts of town. The sign above the door read, "Mabel's Kitchen." Desperation pushed her inside. The warm smell of bread and soup hit her as she stepped in. Behind the counter stood Mabel, a stout woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. "What do you want?" Mabel asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm looking for work, ma'am," Clara said softly, her voice shaking. "I can clean, serve food, anything you need." Mabel squinted at her. "Are you pregnant?" Clara nodded, bracing herself for rejection. "How far along?" Mabel pressed. "A couple of months." Mabel stared at her for a long moment, then sighed. "Well, you won't be very good at lifting heavy stuff, but I need someone to clean tables and help in the kitchen. Pay's not great, but it's honest work." Clara's eyes lit up. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll work hard, I promise." "Don't thank me yet," Mabel grumbled. "You start tomorrow, 6 a.m. sharp. Don't be late." Days turned into weeks, and Clara worked tirelessly at Mabel's kitchen. The work was exhausting, and her feet ached by the end of every shift, but she was grateful. Mabel was tough, but she had a good heart. She fed Clara extra meals when she noticed her skipping lunch and offered advice about pregnancy. "You're stronger than you think, girl," Mabel said one day, handing Clara a bowl of soup. "I raised 3 boys on my own after my husband died. Hard work never killed anyone." Clara smiled weakly. "I'll do whatever it takes for my baby." At night, Clara would lie on her small cot, one hand on her growing belly, whispering promises to her unborn child. "I don't know how yet," she said softly, "but I'll give you the world. I'll make sure you never feel like you don't belong." The months passed and Clara's pregnancy progressed. Mabel became like a surrogate mother, scolding her when she worked too hard and insisting she rest when her back ached. One evening, as the diner closed and the last customers shuffled out, Mabel approached Clara. "You've been saving up, right?" Mabel asked gruffly. Clara nodded. "Every penny, ma'am." "Good. You'll need it when the baby comes. Hospitals don't work for free." Clara's stomach knotted. She had been dreading the delivery costs, but there was no turning back. This baby, her baby, was all that mattered now. Clara went into labor on a stormy night. She had been alone in her room when the contractions started, sharp and relentless. Panic set in as she realized she had no way to get to the hospital. Her cries of pain echoed through the thin walls of her building, and soon one of her neighbors came banging on her door. "You're having the baby, aren't you?" the woman asked, wide-eyed. Clara nodded, sweat pouring down her face. "We need to get you to the clinic," the woman said, helping Clara to her feet. With the help of her neighbors, Clara made it to a small clinic run by midwives. The delivery was long and painful, but as dawn broke, the cries of a baby filled the room. The midwife wrapped the infant in a blanket and placed him in Clara's arms. "It's a boy," the midwife said softly, smiling. Clara stared down at the tiny face, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You're beautiful," she whispered. "Welcome to the world, my son." Clara named him David. From the moment he was born, she vowed to give him everything. It wasn't easy. She returned to work at the diner just weeks after his birth, carrying him in a sling as she cleaned tables and served customers. The other waitresses doted on David, taking turns holding him while Clara worked. Mabel, though gruff, was one of Clara's biggest supporters. "He's a tough one," Mabel said one afternoon, bouncing David on her knee. "Just like his mama." Clara smiled, exhausted but happy. "He deserves a good life." "And he'll get it," Mabel replied firmly. "Because you won't quit. I can see it in your eyes." Clara nodded. She didn't have a plan, but she had determination. She worked longer hours, saving every spare penny. When David was old enough to walk, Clara enrolled him in a small local school, sacrificing meals and sleep to pay the fees. David was a bright child. Even as a boy, he showed an unusual level of focus and intelligence. Clara would often find him reading borrowed books late into the night, the dim light of their single bulb illuminating his face. "Why do you study so much, David?" Clara asked one night, tucking him into their small bed. David looked up at her with serious eyes. "Because I want to be rich one day, Mama, so you won't have to work anymore." Clara's heart swelled with pride and pain. She stroked his hair gently. "You'll do great things, my son. I know it." Years passed, and Clara's hard work began to pay off. She managed to move them into a better neighborhood, one with safer streets and cleaner air. David excelled in school, winning scholarships and the admiration of his teachers. His drive was unstoppable, his determination mirroring Clara's own. By the time David was a teenager, his intelligence and ambition had set him apart. Clara worked tirelessly to support him, taking extra shifts and skipping meals to ensure he never went without. She watched with pride as he grew into a strong, confident young man. One evening, as David returned home with news of a scholarship to a prestigious university abroad, Clara hugged him tightly. "You did it," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Clara sat at the small dining table, staring at the acceptance letter in her trembling hands. David's scholarship to a prestigious university abroad felt like a dream, one she hadn't dared to hope for. Her boy, the child she'd once considered giving up on, was going to have a chance at a life she had only imagined. David, now a tall and determined young man of 18, stood nearby, his eyes filled with excitement. "Mama, I promise I'll make you proud," he said firmly, taking a seat across from her. "This is just the beginning." Clara smiled, though tears brimmed in her eyes. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You already have, David. You already have." Over the following weeks, Clara worked tirelessly to prepare David for his departure. Every penny she had saved went into his travel arrangements and essentials for his new life. On the day he left for the airport, she held him tightly and whispered in his ear, "Don't let anything stop you. Go out there and show the world who you are." David hugged her back, his voice full of resolve. "I'll come back for you, Mama. I promise." Arriving in a foreign country, David was faced with challenges he had never known. The towering buildings, the fast pace of life, and the unfamiliar faces overwhelmed him at first, but his determination never wavered. He threw himself into his studies, spending countless hours in libraries, pushing himself to excel. While his classmates spent their weekends socializing, David worked part-time jobs to support himself. He delivered food, cleaned offices at night, and took on odd jobs to make ends meet. He often ate cheap noodles for days at a time, refusing to ask Clara for help. "She's sacrificed enough," he told himself, staring at a photo of his mother he kept on his desk. "I need to stand on my own." Despite the struggles, David excelled academically. His professors were amazed by his work ethic and intelligence. One of his economics professors, Dr. Walters, took a special interest in him. "David, have you ever thought about starting your own business?" Dr. Walters asked after class one day. David looked up, intrigued. "My own business?" "Yes. You have a mind for numbers and strategy that's rare. Entrepreneurship might be the path for you." The idea planted a seed in David's mind. He began to study successful businesses and entrepreneurs, devouring books and case studies. He attended seminars and networked with professionals, learning as much as he could about the world of business. David's big break came during his third year of university. A competition was announced for young entrepreneurs, offering funding for innovative business ideas. The prize money was significant, enough to change his life. David poured his heart and soul into the competition, working day and night to develop a proposal for a tech company that would provide affordable financial solutions for small businesses. On the day of the competition, David stood in front of a panel of judges, his voice steady and confident as he presented his idea. "The world is full of small businesses with big dreams but no support," he said passionately. "My company will change that. We'll provide tools and systems that empower small entrepreneurs to thrive." The room fell silent as David concluded his presentation. The judges exchanged glances, clearly impressed. Hours later, when the winners were announced, David's name was called. He had won. As he stood on stage, holding the certificate and shaking hands with investors, he couldn't stop smiling. For the first time in his life, the future seemed limitless. With the competition funding, David launched his first company, Empower Solutions, a financial tech firm focused on helping small businesses manage their finances. At just 21 years old, David poured every ounce of his energy into building the business. He surrounded himself with a team of like-minded individuals who believed in his vision, and together, they worked day and night to grow the company. In the first year, Empower Solutions turned a modest profit. By the second year, the company had secured partnerships with several major financial institutions. David's innovative approach and relentless work ethic caught the attention of investors and the media. He was soon featured in business magazines and invited to speak at conferences. "It all started with a simple idea," David said in an interview when asked about his success. "I saw a need and I worked to fill it. But more than that, I knew I couldn't fail, not after everything my mother did for me." Clara, still working to make ends meet, watched her sons rise with pride. David sent her money every month, insisting she quit her job, but she refused. "I'm not ready to sit around doing nothing," she told him over the phone. "You just focus on being great." "You're already great, Mama," David replied softly. By the time David turned 25, Empower Solutions had grown into a billion-dollar company with a global reach. He had offices in major cities, a growing team of employees, and an unshakable reputation as one of the brightest young minds in business. He had fulfilled the promise he made to his mother years ago. He had given her the world. David flew Clara to visit him in his penthouse office overlooking the city skyline. She stepped into the building with wide eyes, marveling at the luxury surrounding her. "This is yours?" she asked in disbelief. David smiled proudly. "Everything, Mama. All because of you." Clara hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. I knew you could do it, David. I always knew. As David's empire continued to grow, he became known for his philanthropy. He funded schools, supported small businesses, and gave back to the community. Yet, despite his success, David remained humble. He never forgot where he came from, and he never stopped honoring his mother. My mother taught me that strength isn't just about power or wealth, he said during a keynote speech. It's about love, sacrifice, and determination. Everything I am, I owe to her. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Maxwell Dalton's once flourishing company, Dalton Enterprises, was on the verge of collapse. Years of mismanagement, reckless decisions, and Maxwell's complacency had taken their toll. Maxwell sat in his office, staring at the latest financial reports. The numbers were grim. His company was bleeding money, and there was no lifeline in sight. To make matters worse, his wife, Lydia, had grown increasingly distant, her disdain for him evident in every word she spoke. Rumors of her infidelity swirled, though Maxwell no longer had the energy to confront her. I need a miracle, Maxwell muttered, rubbing his temples. Something, or someone. His assistant entered the room moments later. Sir, there's a company willing to meet with us to discuss a potential partnership. They might be able to save Dalton Enterprises. Maxwell looked up sharply. Who are they? The assistant glanced at his notes. Empower Solutions, a tech firm. Their CEO wants to meet with you personally. Maxwell frowned. Never heard of them. But if they can save my company, set up the meeting. The assistant nodded and left the room, leaving Maxwell to stare out the window. He had no idea that the CEO of Empower Solutions, the man who held his fate in his hands, was the very boy he had abandoned 15 years ago. Maxwell Dalton adjusted his tie nervously as he stood outside the sleek glass building of Empower Solutions. The company name shone brightly on a steel plaque by the entrance, a symbol of the wealth and power that rested behind those walls. Maxwell, once a man who never second-guessed himself, now felt like a beggar at the gates of a kingdom. This CEO must be something, he muttered to himself as his assistant led him inside. The lobby was a stunning display of modern luxury. Glass walls, polished marble floors, and minimalist furniture created an atmosphere of wealth and elegance. Employees in tailored suits moved purposefully through the space, exuding competence and pride. Maxwell felt a pang of envy as he observed the organization and energy he had lost in his own company. This way, sir, the assistant said, leading him to the elevator. As they ascended to the top floor, Maxwell checked his reflection in the mirrored elevator walls. The once imposing man now looked older, his hair graying at the temples and worry lines deepening across his face. The sharp gleam in his eyes had faded over the years, replaced with exhaustion and desperation. When the elevator doors opened, Maxwell was greeted by an assistant, a sharp young woman with a crisp, professional tone. Mr. Dalton, Mr. David Reed will see you now, she said, guiding him into the CEO's office. The office was magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city's skyline, and a sleek desk sat at the far end of the room. Behind it stood David Reed, tall, confident, and commanding. Maxwell froze momentarily as he took in the man before him. There was something familiar about the young CEO, though he couldn't quite place it. David extended his hand with a polite smile. Mr. Dalton, it's an honor to finally meet you. Please have a seat. Maxwell shook his hand, noting the firm grip. The young man's presence was undeniable. A quiet power radiated from him that Maxwell couldn't ignore. As they sat across from each other, Maxwell cleared his throat and began. Mr. Reed, thank you for taking the time to meet with me. My company, Dalton Enterprises, has encountered some difficulties. We're looking for a strategic partnership to stabilize operations and regain our footing. David folded his hands on the table, his expression calm but unreadable. I'm aware of Dalton Enterprises' situation, Mr. Dalton. It's been making headlines for months now. To be frank, many of my colleagues would say your company is beyond saving. Maxwell flinched, though he tried to hide it. I won't deny that mistakes have been made, but Dalton Enterprises still has value. With the right investment, we can turn things around. David leaned back in his chair, studying Maxwell carefully. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then, he spoke. Why should Empower Solutions invest in your company, Mr. Dalton? What do you bring to the table? Maxwell shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This wasn't going how he had hoped. He had expected the young CEO to jump at the opportunity, not grill him like a schoolteacher. We have decades of experience in the industry, Maxwell said quickly. We have a legacy. Our reputation is in tatters, David interjected sharply, though his voice remained calm. Let's not waste time sugarcoating things, Mr. Dalton. You're here because you're desperate, and I want to understand why you think I should help you. Maxwell was stunned. This young man, barely old enough to be his son, spoke to him with a confidence and authority that left him speechless. For a moment, Maxwell thought about walking out, but then he remembered the crushing weight of his company's debts, the angry shareholders breathing down his neck, and Lydia's cruel laughter when he told her about his troubles. Because I'm willing to fight, Maxwell said finally, his voice low but steady. Because I won't let my company die without doing everything I can to save it. David's eyes softened slightly, though he said nothing. He stood and walked to the window, his back to Maxwell. I'll consider your proposal, David said after a long pause, but I make no promises. I'll have my team review your company's financials, and we'll go from there. Relief washed over Maxwell, though he tried to remain composed. Thank you, Mr. Reed. That's all I ask. David turned back to face him, his expression unreadable once more. We'll be in touch. My assistant will show you out. As Maxwell left the office, he couldn't shake the strange feeling in his gut. There was something about David Reed that unsettled him, something he couldn't quite place. But for now, all that mattered was that he had a chance. A glimmer of hope. David sat back in his chair after Maxwell left, his mind racing. Hearing the name Dalton Enterprises had been a jolt, a ghost from his past that he hadn't been prepared to face. As he looked at the file on his desk, he couldn't help but think of the man who had abandoned his mother all those years ago. Maxwell Dalton, David muttered under his breath. The mighty have fallen. He couldn't deny the satisfaction he felt, but mixed with it was a storm of emotions he hadn't yet sorted through. Does he even remember what he did? Does he remember my mother? David clenched his fists, memories of his mother's struggles flashing through his mind. He thought of the nights Clara worked late, the sacrifices she made, the tears she hid from him when she thought he wasn't looking. And now he comes to me for help? A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant entered, holding a folder. Mr. Reed, we've pulled the financial records for Dalton Enterprises as requested. It doesn't look good. David took the folder and flipped through the documents. The numbers were worse than he expected. The company was hemorrhaging money. Saving Dalton Enterprises would be a significant risk, even for him. Set up a meeting with my advisory board, David said, closing the folder. I need their thoughts on this. Understood, sir. As his assistant left, David leaned back in his chair, staring at the skyline. He knew this decision wasn't just about business. It was personal. What would Mom say if she knew? He wondered. Part of him wanted to walk away, to let Maxwell Dalton lose everything. But another part of him, the part that had always fought to do the right thing, knew he couldn't make this decision lightly. You'll know soon enough, Maxwell Dalton, David said softly. You'll know exactly who I am. Clara stared at her reflection in the mirror of her penthouse suite, her silk robe draping over her shoulders like liquid gold. It had been 15 years since she had been fired from Maxwell Dalton's mansion. 15 years since the humiliation and despair had forced her to reinvent herself. And here she was, radiant and successful, living a life Maxwell could only dream of now. Clara gently clasped a diamond necklace around her neck as memories of the past flooded back. She remembered those first agonizing months after leaving Dalton's house, alone, pregnant, and terrified. She had scraped together what little she had to rent a dingy one-room apartment, surviving on sheer willpower. At the time, the thought of having a child had felt impossible. She had almost walked into that clinic to terminate the pregnancy. Almost. Clara sat down at her vanity, picking up a small photo frame with trembling hands. It was a picture of David at his high school graduation, a day she considered one of the proudest moments of her life. We did it, David, she whispered, a soft smile tugging at her lips. We proved them wrong. Clara remembered how 15 years ago she stood outside the clinic, her stomach twisting in knots as her mind waged war with her heart. The thought of raising a child on her own was unbearable. How would she survive? She had no family, no support system, and Maxwell, the man who had promised so much and given so little, had turned his back on her without a second thought. The memory of his words still burned in her mind. You're nothing but a distraction, Clara. I can't have you here anymore. Those words had shattered her. The man that was responsible had discarded her like she was nothing. But as Clara reached for the clinic door, an older woman passing by stopped and smiled at her. Are you okay, dear? The woman asked gently, her voice full of concern. Clara hesitated, unsure what to say. Tears welled up in her eyes, and before she could stop herself, she broke down. I don't know what to do, Clara sobbed. I can't do this alone. The woman took her hand and led her to a nearby bench. She sat with Clara, listening as she poured out her story. You know, dear, the woman said after a long silence, sometimes the hardest roads lead to the most beautiful destinations. You're stronger than you think, and that child you're carrying might be the greatest gift you'll ever receive. Clara looked at her, a spark of hope flickering in her eyes. For the first time in days, she felt seen, understood. The woman gave her a final squeeze on the hand before leaving, her words echoing in Clara's mind. You're stronger than you think. From that moment, Clara made a promise to herself and her unborn child. She would fight, she would survive, and she would make something of her life, for both of them. Raising David had not been easy. Clara worked hard just to keep a roof over their heads. She would leave home before dawn and return late at night, her body aching and her spirit worn. Yet no matter how tired she was, she always found time for David. She read to him, helped him with his homework, and taught him the importance of hard work and perseverance. David, for his part, was an extraordinary child. Even as a boy, he showed a hunger for knowledge and an innate sense of responsibility. While other kids spent their afternoons playing, David would study or find ways to earn a little extra money to help his mother. By the time he was in high school, he was already winning scholarships and accolades, his name whispered in awe by teachers and peers alike. Mom, one day I'm going to take care of you, David had said after winning a statewide science competition. He held the trophy out to her, his eyes shining with determination. Clara hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. You already take care of me, sweetheart, just by being you. David's brilliance didn't stop there. He was accepted into one of the most prestigious universities on a full scholarship. While there, he discovered his passion for technology and innovation. By his early 20s, he had co-founded a startup that quickly rose to global prominence. David had a vision, and his relentless work ethic turned that vision into a billion-dollar empire, Empower Solutions. Through it all, David never forgot where he came from. He bought Clara her first home, a beautiful villa, and ensured she wanted for nothing. But he never gloated, never grew arrogant. David remained grounded, always grateful for the sacrifices his mother had made. Back in the present, Clara's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of heels clicking on the marble floor. Her assistant appeared at the doorway. Madam, your son wanted me to remind you that dinner is at 7 tonight, the assistant said. Clara nodded with a smile. Thank you. I'll be ready. As her assistant left, Clara rose and walked to the window. The city stretched out before her, a symbol of how far she had come. The woman who had once been dismissed as nothing now stood tall, successful, respected, and loved. Clara's phone buzzed. It was David. Mom, his voice came through the line. I had an interesting meeting today. Oh? Clara asked, pouring herself a glass of water. With whom? Maxwell Dalton, David said simply. Clara froze, the glass slipping slightly in her grip. What? He came to me for help, David continued. His voice was calm, but Clara could hear the undercurrent of emotion. His company is collapsing. He's desperate. Clara sank into a chair, her heart pounding. And what did you say? I told him I'd think about it, David replied. I wanted to talk to you first. Clara's thoughts swirled as she tried to process the news. The man who had ruined her life, who had abandoned her when she needed him most, was now at the mercy of her son. "David," she said quietly, "what do you want to do?" There was a pause on the line. "I don't know yet," David admitted, "but I'm not doing anything without talking to you first. You're the reason I'm here, Mom. I owe you everything." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "David, you don't owe me a thing. I'm just so proud of you." "Thanks, Mom," David said softly. "I'll see you tonight." As the call ended, Clara sat in silence, her emotions a storm of anger, vindication, and disbelief. Maxwell Dalton had no idea what fate had in store for him, but Clara did. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine the moment when their paths would cross again. "You have no idea who you're dealing with now, Maxwell," Clara murmured to herself, a steely determination settling in her chest. "No idea at all." Maxwell Dalton sat in the dim confines of his once grand office, the weight of his empire's collapse pressing down on his shoulders like a vice. The walls, which had once held masterpieces and awards, now felt suffocating. Half the lights were off, the air stale, and the sound of the ceiling fan was the only reprieve from the silence. His assistant, Bernard, stepped in quietly, holding a stack of papers. Bernard was a thin, weary-looking man, far more polished than his employer had become. His suit remained immaculate, even as Maxwell's own tie hung loose, and his hair appeared unkempt. "Sir, the latest reports," Bernard said softly, placing the documents on the desk. Maxwell didn't look up. He simply stared at the papers, his fingers tapping against the mahogany surface. "How bad is it?" he muttered. "We're at the brink, sir. The board is restless, and our creditors—" Bernard hesitated. "They're running out of patience." Maxwell finally looked up, his once sharp eyes dulled by exhaustion and desperation. "And no one will extend the loans?" "No one who trusts us anymore," Bernard replied with brutal honesty. Maxwell exhaled shakily, leaning back in his chair. The irony of his situation was not lost on him. For decades, Maxwell Dalton had been untouchable. His name was synonymous with power, his company a monolith in the business world. People bowed to him, feared him, and admired him. And now, those same people avoided him like the plague. How did it all come to this? The answer was clear: hubris and mismanagement. Maxwell had expanded too aggressively, sinking millions into projects that failed to bear fruit. On top of that, the mounting lawsuits from former employees and investors further eroded the company's foundation. He'd ignored the warnings. He'd ignored the numbers. He thought his name alone could turn things around. He had been wrong. "Bernard," Maxwell said, suddenly sitting up, "set up meetings with any firm willing to consider a partnership. I don't care how small or insignificant. We need a miracle, and I'm not above begging for one." Bernard nodded, scribbling notes. "Actually, sir, I've already arranged a meeting. There's one company, Empower Solutions." The following day, Maxwell arrived at the towering glass skyscraper that housed Empower Solutions. He tilted his head back, taking in the sleek architecture and pristine design again. It was a stark contrast to his own crumbling empire. A poised receptionist greeted him. "Mr. Dalton, please follow me. Mr. David Dalton will see you shortly." Maxwell brushed off the thought and followed the receptionist to a conference room with a sweeping view of the city skyline. The room was immaculate, with minimalist decor and a single large screen displaying the Empower Solutions logo. He didn't have to wait long. The door opened, and in walked David Dalton. Maxwell rose to his feet, extending a hand out of habit. He froze for a split second as he took in David's presence. The young man was tall, charismatic, and impossibly confident. There was something in his eyes, a sharpness, a fire, that unsettled Maxwell. It was as though he were looking at a reflection of his younger self. "Mr. Maxwell Dalton, we meet again," David said, shaking his hand firmly. "Welcome to Empower Solutions. Please, have a seat." Maxwell sat, clearing his throat. "Thank you for meeting with me. I know you're a busy man." David offered a tight smile. "We make time for opportunities." The next hour was grueling. Maxwell presented his case again, pitching the importance of his company's legacy, its past successes, and the potential for recovery. He tried to play to David's ambitions, framing the partnership as a chance to merge innovation with tradition. But throughout the presentation, David remained quiet, his expression unreadable. When Maxwell finished, he waited, his palms sweating. David finally spoke, his voice measured. "Mr. Dalton, your company's numbers are abysmal. Partnerships require trust, and to be honest, your reputation in the industry doesn't inspire much confidence." Maxwell's jaw tightened. "I understand that, but you have the resources to turn this around. I'm willing to make sacrifices, take a smaller role, whatever it takes." David tilted his head, studying him carefully. For a moment, it seemed as though he were looking for something, some hidden clue. "I'll think about it again," David said finally, standing up. "That's all I can promise for now." Maxwell rose as well, frustration bubbling beneath his composed facade. "That's fair. I appreciate your time." David extended his hand again, and Maxwell shook it, feeling an inexplicable chill run through him. Later that night, David sat in his penthouse office, staring at the file on Maxwell Dalton. He had known from the moment he saw Maxwell's face who the man was. His mother had told him everything about Maxwell's betrayal, the man who had discarded them without remorse. Yet here he was now, on his knees, begging for salvation again. The morning sunlight poured into Clara's tastefully decorated living room as she sat motionless, phone in hand. The name Maxwell Dalton hung heavy in the air like a storm cloud. For years, she had kept the memories of that man locked away in the deepest corners of her heart, a past she had tried to bury. But now, it seemed fate had other plans. Her son David sat across from her, his expression unreadable. He looked at her with the same sharp gaze she'd grown so accustomed to, one that mirrored his father's intensity, though tempered with compassion. "Mom, you don't have to come," David said softly. I thought you should know what's happening." Clara's fingers tightened around the edge of the armrest. "You said Maxwell came to your office?" David nodded, leaning forward. "His company is sinking, Mom. He's desperate. He wants Empower Solutions to save him." Clara inhaled sharply, a flicker of disbelief crossing her face. The Maxwell Dalton she remembered was a man who stood atop the world, his arrogance unmatched. The idea of him crawling for help felt surreal, poetic justice in its purest form. "And you met him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did," David replied, his tone steady but tinged with an edge. "He doesn't know who I am. He doesn't know that I'm his son." Clara's throat tightened. She looked down at her hands, her mind racing back 15 years, to the day he had thrown her out. Clara exhaled. She looked at David, her pride mingling with concern. "What are you planning to do?" David leaned back, his jaw tight. "I'm not sure yet. A part of me wants to see him suffer, to make him feel the desperation we felt. But another part of me doesn't want to stoop to his level. That's why I wanted you to come, Mom. I want you to decide." Clara's eyes widened. "Me?" "Yes." David's voice softened. "He hurt you. He hurt us. I built this empire because of what we went through, but I won't make a move unless you tell me to." Clara stared at her son, her heart swelling with emotion. How had she raised such a remarkable man? For all the pain Maxwell had caused, David had turned it into something beautiful. He had broken the cycle. After a long silence, Clara said quietly, "I'll come with you tomorrow. I want to see him, to see the man who thought we were nothing." David nodded, his expression resolute. Then it settled. The following afternoon, Maxwell Dalton sat in the conference room of Empower Solutions, nervously fidgeting with his cufflinks. His assistant sat beside him, equally uncomfortable. "Why haven't they come in yet?" Maxwell grumbled. Before Bernard could answer, the door opened and David stepped in. But he wasn't alone. Clara walked in beside him, poised and radiant, wearing a sleek designer dress that accentuated her grace. Maxwell's eyes widened in shock. The years had been kind to her. She was stunning, her confidence and beauty far surpassing the timid maid he had once discarded. His heart stopped. "Clara?" Maxwell breathed, his voice barely audible. He blinked, unable to believe his eyes. Clara held her head high, her expression unreadable. "Hello, Maxwell." Maxwell stumbled to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What are you doing here?" David stepped forward, his voice firm. "She's here because she deserves to be. You came begging for help, Mr. Dalton, and it's only fair that we lay all the cards on the table." Maxwell's gaze darted between David and Clara, confusion clouding his face. "I don't understand. What's happening here?" David's lips curved into a tight smile. "Oh, you will. You just need a little more time." Maxwell's face paled as realization began to creep into his mind. He turned back to Clara, his voice trembling. "Is this your son?" Clara tilted her head, her expression cool. "Yes, Maxwell. This is our son." Maxwell staggered backward, his legs nearly giving way. He turned to David, his voice a mere whisper. "You're my son?" David's eyes blazed with an intensity that sent a chill down Maxwell's spine. 15 years ago, you threw my mother out like garbage. You left her to fend for herself while you lived like a king." He paused, his voice hardening. "And now, you're standing in my office asking for a handout." Maxwell opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The room spun around him as the full weight of his actions crashed down. Clara stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "You wanted to know what became of us, Maxwell? This is it. This is the life you threw away." Maxwell sank into his chair, the full weight of reality crashing down on him like a tidal wave. His once golden world, his pride, wealth, and status, had crumbled to dust, leaving him a shell of the man he used to be. The revelation that David was his son hit him harder than any business loss ever could. David stood tall at the head of the conference table, his commanding presence a stark contrast to Maxwell's broken posture. Clara remained close by, her gaze unwavering and filled with a quiet strength Maxwell no longer recognized. Silence hung in the room, suffocating and heavy. "You." Maxwell's voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "You're my son?" David's eyes blazed as he folded his arms across his chest. "The son you abandoned. The son my mother raised alone, working herself to the bone to give me a future. You left her with nothing, but somehow she gave me everything." Maxwell struggled to respond, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. The reality was too raw, too painful to confront. "I didn't know," he muttered finally, his voice breaking. Clara stepped forward, her calm demeanor sending a ripple of unease through Maxwell. "You didn't care to know, Maxwell. You didn't give me the chance to explain. You threw me out without hesitation, as if I were worthless." Maxwell buried his face in his hands, shame creeping up his spine like fire. He remembered that day vividly, his cruel dismissal of her, his arrogance, his refusal to hear her out. At the time, he'd felt justified, driven by his selfish desire to protect his reputation. Now, that moment haunted him. "I made a mistake," he said finally, his voice low and unsteady. "A terrible mistake. I was blind and selfish." David's expression remained hard, though a flicker of emotion passed through his eyes. "And now you come here begging for help." He shook his head, incredulous. "You want me to save you after everything you did to my mother? After abandoning us?" Maxwell looked up at David, his face lined with regret. "I didn't know how much I had thrown away. I didn't know you existed, David. I see now what I did, and it's killing me." Clara turned her gaze to David, watching her son carefully. She could see the internal conflict simmering beneath his composed exterior. David had always been a man of principle, a leader who valued fairness and integrity. But she also knew the pain he carried from his past, the deep scars Maxwell had unknowingly left behind. "David," Clara said gently, breaking the tension, "we've come so far. Don't let him drag you back into that darkness." David's eyes softened as he turned to his mother. In that moment, he realized the truth of her words. Clara had spent her life rising above Maxwell's cruelty, refusing to let bitterness consume her. She had built a life of joy, beauty, and resilience. He had done the same. Maxwell's downfall didn't need to be his vengeance. David exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders releasing. He turned back to Maxwell, who looked smaller than ever before, a man hollowed out by his mistakes. "I built Empower Solutions on principles of integrity and compassion," David said evenly. "I refuse to let anger dictate my choices. I won't let your mistakes shape who I am." Maxwell looked up at David, hope flickering in his tired eyes. "Does that mean you'll help me?" David's gaze turned steely. "I'll offer you a deal, a fair deal, nothing more. I will not hand you salvation on a silver platter. If you want Empower Solutions to help your company, you will need to earn it. That means full transparency, accountability, and a commitment to change." Maxwell's breath hitched, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over him. "Thank you," he whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "Thank you, David." David shook his head. "Don't thank me. Thank her," he said, gesturing toward Clara. "My mother is the reason I am the man I am today." Maxwell turned to Clara, his gaze pleading. Clara raised a hand, silencing him. "I don't need your apologies, Maxwell. I forgave you a long time ago. Not for you, but for myself. I refuse to carry the weight of your mistakes. You've been living in the shadow of your actions for years, but that's your burden to bear, not mine." Maxwell bowed his head, unable to meet her gaze. For the first time in his life, he truly understood the cost of his cruelty. The very people he had cast aside were the ones he now depended on. Maxwell Dalton sat at his desk, sifting through the financial reports for his company. Thanks to David's intervention, the company was on the slow road to recovery. Maxwell had been forced to step back, relinquishing control to a team of experts David had appointed. It was humbling to watch strangers fix what he had destroyed, but it was necessary. As he glanced at the framed photo on his desk, a snapshot of David, Clara, and David's leadership team at a charity gala, he felt a pang of bittersweet emotion. He would never fully repair the damage he'd caused, but he could at least honor the second chance he'd been given. Across town, David and Clara stood in front of a newly built school, surrounded by children and teachers. The school bore Clara's name, the Clara Dalton Center for Education. It was David's way of honoring his mother's sacrifices and resilience. "You've outdone yourself, David," Clara said, her eyes misting with pride. David smiled, placing an arm around her shoulders. "This is just the beginning, Mom. Your story inspired me to build something bigger than both of us, and now it'll inspire generations to come." Clara looked out at the joyful children running across the playground, her heart full. She had come so far from the frightened young maid Maxwell had thrown out. Her son had built an empire, not out of vengeance, but out of love and ambition. Maxwell had been humbled. Clara had found peace. And David had rewritten their legacy. As mother and son walked away, hand in hand, Clara whispered softly, "We did it." David smiled. "You did it, Mom. You're the real hero of this story." Together they left the past behind, stepping forward into a brighter, boundless future. Alright guys, we've come to the end of this video, and if you enjoyed it, do well to click on the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to check other videos on our playlist. We've got some amazing stories for you. See you in our next video.